Psalm 118 is the last of those 6 psalms that make up Hallel. When I prayed this morning, when I davened, I chanted the Hallel. And when you get to Psalm 118, it depends on your respective prayer book. This is the one I often use by Koren. It's divided up in such a way that it looks like many psalms. There's parts of it in the beginning, parts of it at the end that are structured as call and refrain. And the middle, the chunk in the middle, verses 5 to 20 or 21, are a narrative that goes back and forth. If anything, what the feel is of this psalm is that of movement. In many ways, it's the culmination of all the psalms. It's simultaneously personal. It makes reference to the temple. It has the sense of communal engagement at the temple or in listening to the psalmist. It is a psalm that celebrates God and yet will verve from I have no fear as part of celebration, part of a context of how God has been good, to help us, God. So there is this kind of movement back and forth, which grammatically is also true in terms of past tense, present tense, future tense, and there will be, as I will point out, a variety of different ways that the translators have approached the tenses and even the translations, in that this psalm will also contain some obscure images and terms. There are 3 possible and more voices you can hear in reading this psalm. Many of the classic commentators, like Rabbi David Kimchi, Radak, who is probably the most quoted of the psalm classic commentators. He again is France, Narbonne, 1160 to 1235. He will say this psalm is a psalm of celebration by King David after Saul died, and King David now knows that he is king. And indeed, in the Talmud, Psachim 119a, there is a focus on verses 21 to 28, all but the last verse, as the chant in honor of King David when he was anointed as king of Israel. And so Radak, others, Rashi, will see this in part, some of the verses as a description of King David assuming responsibility and going back and forth in his mind between the past, the dangers he's overcome, and the celebration of the moment. So that's one possible, if you will, way to hear the psalm. A second way, also popular, is that this is a messianic psalm in which the focus is not David, but Israel. And so when it says, for instance, a very famous line, a stone that the builders rejected became for a head corner, became for a keystone, that is what will be said at the time of redemption, that Israel, who suffered in exile, is now, if you will, the capstone of creation. I will add also that there's a number of verses like that verse I just quoted that are widely quoted in the New Testament, including a quote by Jesus when he's teaching at the temple, and the elders, the chief priest says, who gave you the authority to so teach. He will engage in a number of parables that are suggestive that the priest should not have the authority that they have, but it's the people who do the work, the lowly, who truly are beloved. And Jesus, in response to who gave you the authority, will quote this verse, verses 22 and verse 23, and that will get quoted widely in particularly the book of Matthew, but Mark, Luke, Acts, Peter, as well in that same chapter in Matthew, chapter 21, the description of Jesus coming to Jerusalem and being greeted as the king. The crowd will be quoting verses 26 of our psalm. Which brings me to the last way and the primary way that I read the psalm, having just read it this morning as part of Hallel. And that is as the culmination of prayer to God that has a dimension that begins with the temple, will end with the temple, will begin, if you will, in call and refrain and end in call and refrain. As I read these words in a moment of Psalms, we can often, who are familiar with Hallel, hear it in our mind, it being sung in celebration. And the middle of the psalm, either a Levite who is talking to people gathered on the pilgrimage holiday about life and redemption. There will be echoes of the Song of the Sea, 3 verses, including one of those verses in the psalm, which will be a straight up quote of the Song of the Sea. Aziv ezimrat Yah, vayhi li lishua. My strength and song is Yah, and God has become my deliverance. And so there are echoes in this psalm of the redemption from Egypt, both as the prototype of liberation, so his own individual danger, which he'll describe, is, if you will, part of a larger rhythm of history in which God enters into history to redeem. And so the Psalm 118, which is from Psalm 113 to 118, called Hallel Mitzrayim, the Hallel of Egypt, has a flow toward redemption. And last, Passover, if you consider both the Seder, the rabbinic choices of Haftorah, are messianic. So messianic in terms of understanding why this was seen as a messianic psalm, but also seeing it as a psalm of celebration of Passover. Psalm 118 will echo the past, but make it personal and immediate and communal, the two together, all together. It is the longest of the Hallel psalms and very filled with ideas, as if it's like the last chance to say it all. There will also be a kind of a motion of ellipses with gaps as well. With that, let me read Psalm 118. And there's one other dimension to why I see this psalm as culmination, which you might have seen in my letter of introduction, in that this psalm makes reference to the just, as if all the prayers lead to action, lead to the psalmist, whether he's a Levite or a poet, striving to be one of the just, one who imitates God. And so I've chosen for the title from verse 19, a line that's familiar to many of us from its well-sung melodies. Pitchu li sharei tzedek, open for me gates of justice. I will enter through them. I will thank Yah. One last comment and then I'll read. Repetitive words often convey the goals of a psalm. Here, the repeated word is the opening word, and that first line, verse 1, will also be the closing line. Hodu l'Adonai ki tov, ki li'olam chasdo. Give thanks to Adonai. Surely God is good. Forever is God's kindness. And that line seems to be a well-known prayer line, particularly the ki li'olam chasdo, surely forever is God's kindness, which will get repeated over and over in Psalm 136. But this opening line will also be an opening line in Psalm 136, 106, and 107. And in that sense, there's a quality of a familiar liturgical motif with which the psalm opens. And the word hodu, I translate as give thanks, and I do so knowing that it can also be translated as praise God or acclaim God. But because the longer narrative, and that long narrative is verses 5 to 20, is about having been saved by God, thanks, which is one of the options, seem to be the most well suited for me. So the word hodu, thanks or praise, that will be repeated 5 times. Verses 1, 19, 21, 28, 29. That's part of the rhythm of the psalm. And there's something else that is unusual in the psalm. And that is, the psalm will use the name Yud-He Vav-He repeatedly, but it will have also the name Yah for God. 5 times the word Yah will appear. Some classic commentators say that that name for God, Yah, is the incomplete name for God. It's the short of the Yud-He Vav-He, incomplete, and that only with redemption will we be exposed to the fullness of God's presence. But Yah, there's a dot in the Yah. So if you look at verse 5 where it first appears, it's the last word in the first line. That dot in biblical Hebrew is called a mapik. And it signifies that when Yah is pronounced, there's an extra breath. So it's Yah. Yah is breath. God is breath. God is life. And essential to understanding this psalm is the conveyance that God gives life, saved the psalmist. God is life, the grantor of that which is of supreme importance, worthy of our praise and gratitude. With that again, Yah, that name of God, unusual, gets repeated 5 times also in this psalm. Verses 5, 14, 17, 18, 19. So it becomes an essential part of the narrative. That's all used in the narrative component. With that, Psalm 118. Give thanks to Adonai. Surely God is good. Surely forever is God's kindness. Let Israel now declare, surely forever is God's kindness. Let the house of Aaron now declare, surely forever is God's kindness. Let those in awe of God now declare, surely forever is God's kindness. From the straits I have called upon Yah. Min hameitzar karati Yah, anani v'merchav Yah. God answered me with expansiveness. Adonai is for me. I will not fear. What can a mortal do to me? Adonai is for me as my helper, and I will stare at those who hate me. Better to take refuge in Adonai than to trust in a mortal. Better to take refuge in Adonai than to trust in princes. All nations surrounded me. With the name of Adonai, I surely cut them off. They swarmed me. Further, they surrounded me. In the name of Adonai, I surely cut them off. They swarmed me like bees. They flared like a fire of thorns. With the name of Adonai, I surely cut them off. You pushed me to fall, but Adonai helped me. My strength and song is Yah, and God has become my deliverance. A voice of rejoicing and deliverance is in the tents of the just. The right of Adonai does valiantly. Right of Adonai is exalted. Right of Adonai does valiantly. I shall not die, but shall surely live and recount the doings of Yah. Yah has repeatedly chastised me. But to death never gave me. Open for me gates of justice. I will enter through them. I will thank Yah. This is the gate of Adonai. The just will enter through it. I will give thanks to you. Surely you have answered me and are to me for a deliverance. A stone that the builders rejected became for a head corner. From Adonai it was thus. It is wondrous in our eyes. This is the day that Adonai has made. We will rejoice and be happy in it. Zeh hayom sa Adonai nagila v'nismechavo. Please, Adonai, deliver now. Please, Adonai, let us succeed now. Blessed who comes in the name of Adonai. We bless you from the house of Adonai. El is Adonai and illuminates us. Bind the festival offering with cords until the horns of the altar. My God are you, and I will thank you. My God, I will exalt you. Give thanks to Adonai. Surely God is good. Forever is God's kindness. And so the psalm ends the way it began, the same line, a psalm of rejoicing, concluding the Hallel, Hodu l'Adonai ki tov, ki leolam chasdo, but again, with words that are not unique to this psalm, but are repeated throughout psalms. They're also suggested in Jeremiah 33:11, as if it is a widely known expression at the time this psalm was heard. And we can imagine this psalm being heard at the temple as people gathered in celebration to mark liberation, to mark pilgrimage, for Hallel became identified as the collective of celebratory poems chanted Passover, Sukkot, Shvuot, Rosh Chodesh, later Hanukkah. And so 118 concludes those psalms. There are, now to go back through it, I have to keep track of the time because there's so many important lines, important in terms of the ear of someone like myself. I love the Shlomo Carlebach melody for verse 5. And because of how it's structured, verses 1 and 4 are often done as a call and refrain. And there's two different ways that it's traditionally done. Sometimes, which is the earlier rabbinic way, is you simply repeat after the cantor each of these opening 4 lines. There's another tradition that evolved in the Middle Ages that caught on, and that is after verse 2, you then repeat again verse 1. Same with 3. you repeat Hodu. Verse 4, you repeat Hodu. Some people do it that way. That's grown in popularity in Sephardic and Sfarad, Israeli Hasidic practice. Also note, in terms of call and refrain, that the last 9-10 verses of this psalm are also call and refrain. So that Psalm 118 is structured to be interactive in how it was sung in synagogues and perhaps how it was previously sung at the temple. Min hametzar kaharatiya ahanani vahamerchavya. That's verse 5. From the straits I have called upon Yah. Yah answered me with expansiveness. Now, 2 comments on verse 5, because it's one of my favorite melodies. So it's one of my favorite verses in this psalm. That, again, is the melody of Rabbi Shlomo Carlebach for verse 5. And that is, Min HaMeitzar means literally tsar, from straits, from tsuris. That's the Yiddish for trouble. From my torment, I have called to you. My teacher, Rabbi Abraham Twersky, says this is the moment of the alcoholic reaching rock bottom. And now only in the midst of the lowest point calling out to God from that narrow place. Abravanel, the great Jewish leader and thinker of Spain, Portugal, and then Italy, at the time of the Inquisition of 1492 and the years before and after, says that here's a refrain to remind us of Mitzrayim, Egypt, the same Meitzar, Mitzrayim, the place of narrowness. Because here throughout, as the song begins, which is verse 5, which is the personal account, there's the sense of my life as part of the larger, which leads to the second part of this verse, Anani v'merchavya, Yah answered me with expansiveness. And here there's a question, namely, it can be understood, he answered me from expansiveness, Yah, that's going straight across, so that God is the one found in expansiveness. That's the place from which God answered me. God is the place of expansiveness, and it can be, he answered me with expansiveness, so that I no longer felt as if I was in the rut, hemmed in. I felt I could breathe openly. I could breathe expansively. I was freed. So that ambiguity is, again, the power of the poetry, more than one possibility. And so now he begins to describe his challenges in life and how it is God who saved him. He hence has no fear. He's not afraid of mere mortals. God, in verse 7, is his helper. Better to take refuge in God than to rely on mortals. Better to take refuge in Adonai than in princes. And now a little touch of 8 and 9 are structured by this better and better to be kind of a wisdom teaching. I'll also pause. I mentioned yesterday with Psalm 117 that in the King James Version, Psalm 117 were the middle chapters of the Bible when it's combined. That's the Protestant Bible. Here, verses 8 and 9 are the middle verses, not chapters, but verses of the King James Version count. So that's another reason Psalm 118 is of such central importance in the Christian tradition. And so now verse 10, a sense of the danger. All nations surrounded me. And again, this can be David referring back to his career and his life, or the people of Israel, and looking future, or simply living in any time in which one felt geopolitically endangered. And here the word, I will surely cut them off, amilam, is an ambiguous word, a rare word. There are three possibilities in terms of the Hebrew, which is it can mean I will surely, they were sure, I am surely, ki amilam, they were against me, from mul, or milah, which milah, like brit milah, circumcision, is the cutting off of the foreskin. I surely cut them off. Often translated, I surely cut them down. I preferred off in terms of they surrounded me, but I didn't feel they controlled me. The other possible way for this obscure word of amilan is milel, which means to speak, which meant I surely quieted them. And here I'll point out, the presentation Ahuva made the other day about the word ki. It can be used in many ways. It's often ignored. Some say it's a indication in some cases of quotation marks. It can mean because or for, but here I translate it as surely. You'll see it appearing a lot in the beginning. Ki tov, ki leolam chasdo. So all my surelys. Benjamin Siegel will translate it as indeed instead of surely. So again, in most translations, it's ignored, which I think is losing a sense of the emphasis. And now that description of the danger and repetition, sabuni, sivavuni, sabuni, you get it here already in verse 10, the word sivavuni. He feels encircled, back to that sense of narrow places. They swarmed me, they surrounded me. But again, confidence in the name of Adonai, I surely cut them off. They swarmed me like bees. So you can feel that sense of claustrophobia, the sense of being encircled by the bees. And here, sabuni and sivavuni, one I choose to translate as swarmed, and the others encircled or surrounded. Here a rare word, doachu. And here the image is flared because a fire of thorns, so bees and thorns, we can feel ourselves being pierced. You can see why this would again be important in Christian circles. So back to the imagery, the thorns quickly catch fire, but also are quickly extinguished. And so another translation often used is they extinguished like a fire of thorns, meaning quickly, which I convey with the word flared, for again, a word that's not often used, but sounds a lot. Look at verse 13. Doachu, that's the flared, and then dacho dechitani. You can hear the rhythmic similarity, but a different word. It's spelled doachu with an ayin, no ayin in dacho dechitani. And that can either be translated as you surely pushed me, or you pushed and pushed me. And here in verse 13, there's a subtle pivot where now the psalmist is addressing his foe directly. And so again, there's the sense of movement, uncertainty. Who's talking to who? My strength, and now shifting back. And again, verses 14 to 16 echo, verse 14 in particular, literally, the song of the sea. And the right being referred to is often translated as the right hand. The implication being, we've seen this repeatedly in Psalms, that God's right is that which wields a sword. The right is power. And so the right signifies the power, the right hand of Adonai does valiantly. And the word chayil, like in Eshet chayil, the last, Proverbs 31, the description of the model word, chayil is understood as being of energy, of generosity, of power, literally. In modern Hebrew, a chayal is a soldier. And again, if power is the ability to affect change, a soldier, one affecting change. And I will point out, because I like to count the middle word. The middle word is between 15 and 16, so that the middle of this psalm, what the psalm is conveying as its bullseye, is valiantly, chayil, yamin, right. Meaning this is conveying God is my source of power. That's the bullseye for this entire psalm. I'm going to go over a little. It's a long psalm. Just some key things to point out. Verse 17, I shall not die, but shall surely live. Homiletically, there gets a lot of play because we're all going to die. So clearly this is speaking in the moment because everybody dies. But the Hasidic play is that there are those who are still alive and as if dead. And therefore, back to being in the straits, here he's saying, I am going to live my life, and I do so in order, which we see as again a key motif, to praise God. Verse 17, I shall not die, but shall surely live, and recount the doings of Yah. And now, a suggestion that his life hasn't always been that easy. Yah has repeatedly chastised me, but to death never gave me. And now, moving toward action, or if you will, moving toward either in his mind or physically, or in the minds of all those listening who are going to start to do call and refrain after these next two verses. Pitchu li sharei tzedek, open for me gates of justice. I will enter through them. I will thank Yah. This is the gate of Adonai. The just will enter through it. And so here he sees himself as being worthy of entering into the temple, as being a person who is just. Although he has been chastised by God, although he has faltered, although he has had enemies and struggles, here at the core, he's defining himself as worthy of God's presence, of being a righteous person. The Zohar, third volume, 95a, will say that these verses, quoting them, 19 and 20, are a response of the psalmist to a statement by God, where God says, open your hearts to me, even with an opening as tiny as a pinpoint. I will open for you the massive gates of heaven. And then the psalmist says, I enter to find God and to cleave to God. And so here, beyond the physical space, this again can be read more broadly as coming into God's presence. And the rest of the psalm is, I give thanks to you, surely you have answered me, are to me for deliverance. This verse 22, a stone the builders rejected became for a head corner. That's literally of Rosh, head, Pina, corner, capstone. A closing two comments. In the Lev Shalem Sidur that we use in our synagogue that has commentaries, it says regarding this capstone, which in the King James Version is translated as headstone. Lev translates it as keystone. Benjamin Summer is quoted as saying that the image here is of an arch And in the center of the arch is a very small stone that keeps it in balance. All the pressure is on that point, but that small stone, that keystone, enables the entire structure to remain intact. And that's the image used here, and it's used here for Israel. From Adonai it was thus, it was wondrous in our eyes. Again, here a description of deliverance, and the classic commentators see this as what is chanted with the announcement of the messianic wholeness. This is the day that Adonai has made. We rejoice and be happy in it. Please, Adonai, deliver now. So again, it's like it's been announced but not yet completed, that deliverance. Now a shift from celebrating the past to an immediate need. Please, Adonai, let us succeed now. Blessed who comes in the name of Adonai, we bless you from the house of Adonai. Here it's as if this is being chanted by the Levites on the temple, welcoming. Menachem Mendel Schneerson, the Lubavitcher Rebbe, will point out regarding verse 26 that the first phrase is in the singular, the second phrase is in the plural, a way to convey that each individual is essential, each individual is welcomed because each counts, and yet they are part of a larger collective which is also essential, hence the singular and then the plural. El is Adonai and illuminates us. Here the illuminates us, V'ye'er lanu, is suggested of the priestly blessings at the temple, number 625, in which the priests are the vessels of illumination of God's light. Bind the festival offerings with cords until the horns of the altar is obscure. Commentators aren't in agreement as to what that is referring to. It can be as simple as take cords and bring your offerings, to something suggested of Sukkot and take the myrtle and tie it onto the altar, which others understand. My God are you, Eli ata v'odeka, Elohai aromeka, my God, I will exalt you. Give thanks to Adonai, hodu l'Adonai ki tov, surely God is good, forever. Ki leolam chasdo is God's kindness. With that, there is so much more to share about this psalm. It is wonderful to see you, now that I removed the text, and to harvest some of your reactions or questions. Cantor Shula, who has been the one to know these verses the best as a cantor. Go ahead, Shula.
I was looking at, first of all, it's a great psalm. I love and adore this psalm for the same reasons you do, because so many gorgeous musical moments have come out of it and the message is there. But I was looking at verse 12, and again, a language thing. The word da'achu in the Hebrew that I know does not mean flare, but means fade. So I see a different, interesting picture being drawn here. They surround me like bees, and you know, bees buzz, buzz, buzz. And then because I am able to cut them off with God's name, they fade like a fading fire on thorns.
Well, I love that. That's very helpful. I didn't know that Hebrew word. That's very helpful to me. In terms of modern Hebrew, it's a rare word in the Bible. And my sense is that the modern Hebrew, where it's fade, probably came from where, again, in the commentaries and all the translations I've looked at, tend to more commonly translate doahu as extinguish, and the image of flare, because it's an obscure word, is because of the context, in that thorns, like you, actually burn very brightly, and they're done. So they fade, but in this context, because of the thorns, it's more like a sparkles, those sparkles you light up.
Mhm.
So it's fascinating also to see, with your help, how the Hebrew language has taken a word here from the Psalms and how it's taken on the meaning of fade. And it's appropriate to bring ourselves into reading a psalm. We can't know what the psalmist intended when the psalmist used the word whoever and whenever the psalm was written. And so when we read a poem, we read it with the way we relate to the words. I've shared this a long time ago in my teaching, but the first time I heard a poet present was at Arizona State. It was my first semester of college, an evening reading, and somebody said to the poet, "Did you intend this when you wrote the poem, this interpretation?" And the poet said, "It's irrelevant what I intended. I wrote a poem so that you, the reader, could engage and be moved, and you'll clearly be engaged and moved by what you bring of yourself." And so that's also the value of bringing in a modern ear, as Cantor Shula just did, to the reading as well. Other comments in regard to Psalm 118? Our closing psalm. Mimi, go ahead. Nice to have you share. Go ahead, Mimi.
I notice in verses 8 and 9,
Yes.
better to take refuge in Adonai than to trust in a mortal, and then
Yeah.
trust in princes, the singular and the plural. And then when I glance through, I realize there's a lot of interchange between singular and plural.
Right. So some comments in that regard in terms of Mimi, pointing out that verse 8 says, Miptoach ba'adam, then trusting in Adam. And then verse 9 says, better to take refuge in Adonai than Miptoach bindivim, which is in the plural. Now, some translators will translate Adam as humanity. So they'll take it as a singular, but I often like the contrast of the individual, meaning in a mortal, any person is conveyed rather than a collective. But it can be the collective or an individual. But I like the individual in contrast to nidivim, which is plural, princes, often translated as nobles or authorities in the plural. And commentators will say that more than those who wield political power, God will ultimately be the one who will choose the outcome. So good pickup, Mimi, in terms of a mortal, and in the plural, nidivim, princesses. And again, that's just one other opportunity for me to share how when one opens up Psalm 118 in a prayer book, in the Haggadah, in many of the books on Psalms, you will find these differences of translation. Let me give you one example of a hard verse and different ways it got translated. Verse 23. I'll put it up just to share with you because it relates to Mimi's comment. So verse 23, in Hebrew, Me'et Adonai Haita. This gets translated by Benjamin Siegel, for instance, from the Lord this has come to be. This is again verse 23. King James Version, this is the Lord's doing. Literally, Me'et is from Adonai Haita, which I translated as it was thus, because that's what Haita means. So whatever got described above, how the stone that the builders rejected became that head corner, from Adonai it was thus. It is wondrous in our eyes. Everybody translates it was wondrous in our eyes basically the same. But the first phrase, there's a lot of variation because it is uncertain in the words used. All right. One last comment. We were a little bit longer today. Is that Luis? Go ahead, Luis. And Chuck?
I just want to say that I really enjoyed this conversation because there's so many familiar parts in it, and it's interesting to go deeper into their meaning because, we say them on Shabbat, we say them when we do Hallel. And so I've enjoyed this particular discussion of this psalm very much.
I'm grateful for that. So let me react to that and then we'll pull this together and do Kaddish. As Luis says, all too often for me, I know the psalm from singing it. And like the Mina Meitzar Karatiyah, that's a line I particularly love singing and also have a feel, but do not have previously to this preparation and presentation, a sense of how that line from the narrow places I called upon Yah and Yah answered me from expansiveness, how that is the beginning of a narrative in this psalm that had at the beginning call and refrain of community, after the narrative call and refrain of community. So even in the way that the whole is constructed, as we come to the end of Hallel, we find ourselves in community, call and refrain, hearing a narrative of struggle and salvation, and back to a larger, more expansive call and refrain. In that light, Psalm 118 leaves us singing, and I wish all of us to continue to hear these words now, both as song, but also as part of something emotionally and communally much more dynamic and therefore evocative.